There's a sequence in which the P-40s are on there's 17 fiberglass P-40s that are going to be strafed by the Japanese at Hickam Field. They were all lined up. Some of them had pyrotechnics in them and so on. And you see the Japanese planes coming down and strafing the line. There's one P-40 that's radio controlled, and you see it coming out, and it's moving down the line. And what's supposed to happen is that it's going to explode, and it's going to collapse on the runway or on the taxiway as it's coming by. Didn't quite work like they expected. The explosion did not flatten it. It got out of control. And there are some stuntmen in that shot who you see running away from it. They're not acting. They're running for their lives. Those P-40s were so well designed, they were so good that you couldn't tell they weren't real P-40s from a few yards away. And Diz Laird and his Navy buddies are looking at these planes and they're admiring them. And then the two real P-40s, one of which was owned by Planes of Fame in Chino, landed at the runway, and the two pilots got out and they went into the administration building. And Diz Laird said, "Oh, I've got an idea." So he says, "Come on, let's switch one of those planes." So they pulled one of the fake P-40s out of a line, put the real one in, and switched them. And then they went back to acting nonchalant. A little while later, the two pilots come out. First guy climbed into his plane, jumped into the seat, start the engine. The other guy climbed up in a wing, jumped into his plane, and disappears. There's no seat. He climbs out, and he's looking around the plane, and he's looking, and finally he sees Diz Laird and all his buddies rolling on the ground laughing. And he said, "All right, which one of you took my plane?" That's the kind of stuff that happened behind the scenes in Tora, Tora, Tora. 30 Seconds Over Tokyo is probably one of the best air war movies ever made. Tells an extremely faithful rendition of the Doolittle raid in April of 1942. I was fortunate to talk to Dave Thatcher, Sergeant Dave Thatcher, who was the crew chief on plane number 7, Ted Lawson's plane, the one that is depicted in the film, the ruptured duck. He had been in Europe and North Africa until just before filming wrapped. He returned to the United States. He was stationed in Santa Monica, and he heard about the movie. So he went to the studio, and he was able to see some of the last things being done. He met Robert Walker, who played himself in the movie. He was very impressed. And I asked him, "What did you think of the movie as a whole?" He said, "They did a great job. It's extremely realistic. There's only a couple of minor technical inaccuracies, but nothing really worth talking about. All the flying sequences are real. When they're taking off the B-25s in less than 500 feet, they're actually doing it in the movie. And the takeoff sequences from the Hornet were done with the aid of this man, A. Arnold Gillespie, who was known as the Wizard of MGM. I mean, he went back to Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz. The man was a genius. He built a 60-foot model of the Hornet and put it in a tank with moving water, and 16 scale B-25 models. Every one of them had running engines and working control surfaces, and they took them off with from piano wire guides. And when this was matched with studio footage and actual newsreel footage, you can't tell what's real and what isn't. It's that good. That is one of the masterpieces of MGM's work during the war. Now, airline disaster films. Only Americans would get a kick out of watching a movie about a crashing airliner. I don't know what it is about us, but we like movies like that. And they were a real phenomenon in the 70s. But they go back quite a bit farther, probably as far back as 1929, 1930, 1935 when 5 came back. But the first, No Highway in the Sky with Jimmy Stewart, 1957 is another one. But this one, done in 1960, was called The Crowded Sky, and it was with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. and Dana Andrews. Ephraim Zimbalist is a Navy pilot who's ferrying a T-33 Shooting Star across the country with Troy Donahue in the back seat. And they're flying across, they're having spotty radio communication. They don't know they're on a collision course with an airliner flown by Dana Andrews. This was the first movie in which you had a lot of crewmen and passengers who had serious relationship problems, and you spend the entire movie listening to these people. And then after a while, you think, oh, please, just let them crash. They're on a collision course with each other. And at the very end of the film, when they see each other, just at that last instant, Zimbalist dives to avoid hitting it, and Troy Donahue ejects. He is killed. The airliner makes it back, unfortunately. But in any event, that was the first major motion picture about an airline collision. Well, Zimbalist, who lived up in down in Solvang, I'm sorry, I'm still in San Diego in my head, California, chuckled about this movie. He said it was really hot in that T-33 cockpit. It was sealed up, and they had to do our makeup like every 10 minutes because we were sweating so much. But he said it's remarkable how they could take miniatures and make them look real. Well, the pilot of that DC-6 that he crashes into is Dana Andrews. Well, 14 years later, Dana Andrews got back at him because he was flying the Beechcraft Baron that crashes into the 747 flown by Ephraim Zimbalist in Airport 1975. He said it took him 15 years to get back at me, but he finally did. Airport 75 is probably the most famous of the airline disaster films. The first one would technically have been Airport, then it was followed by Airport 77, Airport 79, the Concorde, and then Starflight, the flight that couldn't land. Universal did all of these, and Universal, as one friend of mine put it, Universal was number one at being number two. But the aerial sequences in Airport 75 are pretty spectacular. They rented an American Airlines 747 for 3 days at a cost of $25,000 a day, and filmed it over the Wasatch Mountains, doing all these sequences. They painted out American and put Columbia on there. I've always wondered if the fact that Columbia was a rival studio was intentional or accidental. In any case, but it sparked the airport disaster film, and I used disaster in more than one way. There's a chapter about woolly birds and gas bags, helicopters and airships. When Clint Eastwood made Firefox, he was trying to make a star out of an aircraft. He didn't do a very good job of it. Firefox was a miserable disaster in many ways. But it could be done, and Blue Thunder actually pulled it off. Blue Thunder made a star out of a helicopter. It was an extremely popular film, very, very action-packed. It was one of the very first of the aircraft action movies. When I say it made a star out of his helicopter, I'm not kidding, because people believe this thing was real. When I've talked to helicopter pilots and asked them, could Blue Thunder really exist? I mean, with all that extra hardware? And they said, no, you'd pretty much be flying it like this, because there would be so much, all that hardware would be much too heavy to fly. But a lot of people were convinced it was real. Well, one of the features on Blue Thunder was called a whisper mode. If any of you recall that film, where they could hover outside a building and eavesdrop on on the people inside without being heard. And a lot of people took that seriously. In the Midwest, there was a town hall meeting between the police helicopter division and a bunch of irate citizens who were tired of all the helicopter noise. And so one citizen stand up to tell to the police people, and he said, listen, I know you guys got to do your job, but why don't you just get helicopters with that whisper mode on them? Well, the cop must have been gritting his teeth and trying not to laugh, but he said, well, sir, I'm sorry, but that's only available in Hollywood. The guy didn't stop at that. He said, well, I don't care where you have to go to get it, just get it. Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Indiana Jones movies, got some wonderful aviation sequences, especially in Raiders of the Lost Ark. When Indy is getting ready to fly across to across the Pacific, and he climbed into a China Clipper. There are no Boeing or Martin China Clippers left in the world. But the closest that the studio could get a hold of was a short stolen, which is at the Arizona Aviation Museum. Not Arizona, excuse me, Oakland Aviation Museum. And it looked close enough to do the job. And you see him climbing into it, and then you've got one propeller spinning. They managed to get one of the Hercules engines turning just long enough to film it and get it into the shot. So that's the plane that you see Indy getting into, and then it shows to the model later. Also, at the beginning of the film, when Indy is running away from the Jovitos Indians, for some reason they're really annoyed at him for desecrating their temple and stealing their god. So they're trying to kill him, and they're chasing him all the way back to the river with spears and blow darts. And he's running out to the river, and he's going to jump into this plane that his friend Jock is fishing off the float. And he's yelling, "Come on, Jock, get it up, let's go, let's go." And he jumps into the water, and he swims out to the plane, keeping his hat on the whole time, you notice. And he climbs up into the plane, and they start the engine, and they start taxiing away. This movie was made by Steven Spielberg, and if you look closely at the designation on the insignia, not the insignia, but the letters on the side of the plane, it's OBCPO, as a tribute to his fellow USC alumnus, George Lucas. It only shows up for 3 frames, but it's a nice little tongue-in-cheek bit of trivia. The Great Waldo Pepper, right up there with Wings, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best aviation films ever made, 1975, with Robert Redford, using real airplanes, real cameras, real pilots. There's almost nothing simulated in Waldo Pepper. It tells what life was like for pilots during the barnstorming era from about 1920 to 1925. It's very well done. It's so well done that when you watch the movie for the first time, you can't help it if Waldo Pepper were the real person. No, he's completely fictional. George Roy Hill did a superb job of telling this story. Some of the stunts done in Waldo Pepper are spectacular to watch. Jim Appleby, I talked to his widow, Zona. She gave me a lot of great information about the making of the film. Frank Tallman, Frank Pine, and Art Scholl were stunt pilots for this film. One of the more memorable ones is when this plane is flying down the center of this street in Texas. This is real. They did not fake this. This plane is really flying down the middle of the street, 8 feet off the ground, with 6 feet of clearance on either side of the wingtip. Considering that Frank Tallman was doing this with only one leg, that's pretty remarkable. He had a prosthetic leg, and he had to actually have it strapped to the rudder pedal, but he still managed to pull off this stunt. George Roy Hill wanted to have a sequence in which a plane crashes into a building, but the studio said, no, we're running out of money, you're going over budget, we don't have time, we'll let you do it in another movie. So he finally got a chance later on. Keep 'em Flying. There's a chapter about comedy. The funny thing happened to me in the air, the comedy films. And Keep 'em Flying is somewhat notable as one of the 3 military-themed Abbott and Costello films, the other 2 being In the Navy and Buck Privates. Very successful movies. This was filmed at Cal Aero Academy in what is now Chino, California, one of the early academies for military training. The commandant of Cal Aero Academy at the time was Major Robert L. Scott, the same one who a year later would become famous for God Is My Co-Pilot. He did most of the stunt flying and the sequences in which you see Lou Costello in a PT-22 monoplane careening through a hangar on the ground, causing all sorts of havoc. That's Robert Scott behind the controls. Why I consider it also notable is the release date. The movie premiered in Hollywood on the night of the 26th of November, 1941. That very same day, the Japanese First Air Fleet was leaving Hitokapu Bay on its way to Pearl Harbor. Those magnificent men in their flying machines. If Great Waldo Pepper is one of the best dramas of the silent film and early flight era, Magnificent Men is one of the best comedies. They assembled and built more than a dozen extremely unique and rare aircraft for this film. Some of them actually flew, some of them were suspended from wire. But planes like the Bristol Bach Kite and the Avro, the Levasseur, Antoinette, the Santos Dumont de Moselle, and the Avro 4 triplane, the AV Row triplane, are just some of the planes you will see in this movie. It's for nothing else. It's worth watching because you can see an unbelievable collection of a kind of weird design people were willing to try around 1909 to see if they could make it fly. Most of them didn't work, but these did. 1941, also done by Spielberg, about the hysteria in the week after Pearl Harbor in Los Angeles. It was originally going to be a drama. He actually should have stuck with keeping it a drama, but it ended up being a comedy with John Belushi, Robert Stack, Tim Matheson. I do enjoy it. It's got a really special B-17 in it. Early in the film, you see Robert Stack as General Joe Stilwell talking. There's a B-17 in the background. This was filmed at March Air Force Base in Riverside County. That B-17 is Sentimental Journey, which is owned and operated by the Commemorative Air Force out of Mesa, Arizona. There's also a P-40 flown by Captain Wild Bill Kelso and by John Belushi in the film. That's owned by Planes of Fame in Chino, California. When they're flying through the Grand Canyon, they're really doing that. It was extremely tight and hairy in there, but they did it over and over again until they had the shot that Spielberg wanted. And it's a mad, 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 mad world. Not an aviation film, but still got some notable aviation sequences in it. Frank Tallman did both of these stunts with a Beechcraft 18. This is where Mickey Rooney and Buddy Hackett are completely inept at flying. They're trying to control the plane while Jim Backus is passed out drunk in the rear cabin. And they're causing all sorts of havoc in the air. And during that time, they managed to pull off some pretty spectacular stunts. Frank Tallman did both of these sequences, the one in which he flew through a billboard. He had to practice very carefully. The billboard was made of balsa wood and paper, and it was placed at the end of what is now John Wayne Airport in Orange County. And there's a bullseye painted on the back of that billboard. He shut off the engine, lowered the landing gear, and flew straight through it. It shattered his windshield, and he had to set down immediately after, because that's why it was set at the end of the runway, because he knew he'd lose power the instant he went through it. The second stunt, in which he went through a hangar, originally he was just going to fly in and land, and then they would reshoot and then have him fly out, and they would splice the two shots together. But they couldn't make that look good. He said, okay, I'll do it. So when you see him fly through, he did it only once, but he went through at about 135 miles an hour. In one path. That hangar is up at Santa Rosa Airport. And he had to peel away instantly after getting out of his shot because there was a row of trees on the other side. You don't get away with stuff like that anymore. But in the 1960s, you could. When George Roy Hill said he wanted to do a building crash in Great Waldo Pepper, and they said no, he got it into World According to Garp with Robin Williams. The reason this is mentioned in the book is because Zona Appleby's husband, late husband, Jim Appleby, did the stunt with the Aranca Model 7 Champ. The building was set up at the side of the runway in Lincoln Park, New Jersey. And it was just a false-sided building, and he had a target. There was a wooden vent cover that he was aiming for. And he was going to fly right into the building. It was supposed to shear off the wings. And then there was a cargo net on the other side of the wall, a cargo net that would catch him and keep him from being flung back out or going straight through. Well, when the grips and putting this all together, they asked Jim, what do you want to cushion your impact? And he said, well, just give me Dolly Parton. That'll do fine. They couldn't get Dolly Parton, so they put a Playboy centerfold in the middle of a cargo net. And Zona told me that when Jim went through that wall, his propeller hub hit that centerfold right in the belly button. And she still has it. It didn't quite impact the way they expected. It didn't tear the wings off. It just folded them back a little bit. And he couldn't get out of the plane, so they had to literally cut him out. But when you see the pilot actually exit the plane and say, excuse me, can I use your telephone? That is George Roy Hill, the director. I hope that just the teasers that I've given you here for the 174 movies that are in the book will give you an idea of what you will find in Flying on Film. There's a handout that JD has, I'm not sure how he's getting them out to you, that lists every film in the book. And I will be happy to answer